Something changed in American retirement that most people never saw coming. And by the time millions of workers realized what had happened, it was already too late to fix. For most of the 20th century, the retirement system in the United States rested on what economists called the three-legged stool: Social Security, personal savings, and a pension. The pension was the critical leg. It was the defined benefit plan, the promise from an employer that if you worked for 30 years, the company would pay you a fixed monthly income for the rest of your life. You did not manage investments. You did not make decisions about asset allocation. You showed up, you worked, and when you retired, the check arrived every month until you died. That system began to collapse in the 1980s. The Revenue Act of 1978 had created a provision known as Section 401(k), which allowed employees to contribute pre-tax income to personal retirement accounts. Employers saw immediately what this meant. Instead of promising a fixed benefit to every retiree for life, they could offer matching contributions to employees' voluntary accounts and walk away from the long-term liability of defined benefits. Between 1980 and 2000, the share of private sector workers covered by traditional pension plans fell from 38% to 21%. Today, that number has collapsed to roughly 15%. Tens of millions of Americans who were told to manage their own retirement through stock market investments they were not trained to navigate, arrived at retirement age having invested too little, withdrawn too early, or watched their accounts collapse during the downturns of 2008 and 2020. The leg is gone, and the stool has fallen. Half of retirees have less than $145,000 saved. The number that defines the American retirement crisis is not found in abstract policy documents or economic forecasts. It is found in the savings accounts of ordinary people who worked for decades and arrived at the end of their careers with a fraction of what they would need. Half of American retirees have less than $145,000 saved for retirement. That is the finding from research published by Clever Real Estate, based on analysis of federal survey data from the Federal Reserve Survey of Consumer Finances and the Health and Retirement Study. The median retiree does not have $200,000. They do not have the $300,000 that financial planners commonly cite as a baseline. They have less than $145,000. The recommended amount, calculated as 10 times the median worker's pre-retirement income, is $572,000. Half of American retirees have approximately 1/4 of that. The average retiree, not the median, but the average, has $269,078 in savings, still less than half of the recommended amount for beginning retirement comfortably. Those who retired in 2021 or later are in significantly worse shape. Half of this more recent cohort has $90,000 or less in retirement savings, less than a fifth of what experts recommend. These are people who retired into a world of rising inflation, rising healthcare costs, and a Social Security system that by itself provides a median monthly benefit of roughly $2,071, an income that most financial planners consider inadequate as a sole source of retirement support. 1 in 5 retirees, 19%, report that their savings have already run out entirely. Not nearly empty, gone. Before we continue, don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss our upcoming updates on the situation in the United States. Thank you for your support, and let's continue. 27% of retirees have zero retirement savings today. The retirement savings gap in the United States is not simply a matter of people having saved too little. For more than 1 in 4 American retirees, the gap is total. There is nothing in the account. There is no account. Research published in 2025 by Clever Real Estate based on nationally representative survey data found that 27% of American retirees report having no retirement savings whatsoever. Not inadequate savings. Not savings below recommended levels. 0. Among the retirees who report having nothing saved, the patterns are documented and consistent. 60% say they mostly lived paycheck to paycheck before retiring, never having enough margin between income and expenses to put anything away. 41% say they had to pay for unexpected expenses, medical bills, legal costs, family emergencies. That consumed whatever savings they had managed to accumulate. 36% acknowledged that their own poor saving habits contributed to the outcome. The gender gap in this data is significant. Retired women are 38% more likely than retired men to report having nothing saved for retirement. This reflects decades of documented wage inequality, career interruptions for caregiving, and a retirement savings system that rewards continuous full-time employment with rising wages. A description that matches the career trajectories of men far more than women in the generations now reaching retirement age. More than 1 in 7 retirees, 15%, report relying on their children for financial support. These are parents and grandparents who raised families, worked jobs, paid taxes, and arrived at the end of their lives financially dependent on the next generation. And in the states with the highest concentrations of older adults, Florida, Arizona, Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Ohio, the scale of this dependency is reshaping family finances across multiple generations simultaneously. 17 million seniors live below 200% poverty line. The official poverty line in the United States is a measure designed in 1963 based on food costs at a time when Americans spent roughly 1/3 of their income on groceries. Economists and public health researchers have criticized it for decades as a profound underestimate of what it actually costs to live in modern America. The National Council on Aging uses a different standard. 200% of the federal poverty level, which in 2026 amounts to $31,920 per year for a single person. By that measure, more than 17 million Americans aged 65 and older are economically insecure. That is roughly 1 in 3 Americans over 65, living in a zone of financial vulnerability where a single unexpected event can trigger a cascade of consequences they have no resources to absorb. The geographic and demographic distribution of this insecurity is not random. Economic insecurity is higher among minority older adults. 44.1% of Black Americans and 42.1% of Hispanic Americans aged 65 and older have incomes below 200% of the federal poverty level. Older women are more likely to live in poverty than men, a consequence of wage discrimination and time spent outside the paid workforce for caregiving responsibilities. Researchers who developed the Elder Economic Security Standard Index, a tool that measures the income older adults actually need to meet basic needs and age in place, county by county, have found that nearly 50% of adults aged 60 and older had household incomes below the Elder Index value for where they lived. This means their income was below the standard required to pay for housing, food, transportation, healthcare, and basic household expenses in their specific community. Not comfortably, not adequately. Below the floor. Social Security benefits lift 16.3 million older adults above the federal poverty line. Without Social Security, the poverty crisis among elderly Americans would be catastrophically worse than it already is. Senior poverty rate climbed to 15% in 2024. In September of 2025, the United States Census Bureau released its annual report on poverty, income, and health insurance. The numbers for elderly Americans told a story that the National Council on Aging described, in a formal statement from its president and chief executive, as shocking and unacceptable. Under the supplemental poverty measure, the more accurate of the two federal poverty calculations because it accounts for geographic variation in housing costs, medical expenses, government benefits, and taxes, the poverty rate among older adults climbed to 15% in 2024. That was up from 14% in each of the 2 preceding years. 15% represents approximately 9.2 million Americans aged 65 and older living in conditions of poverty, not near poverty, not low income by some technical definition. Poverty. The inability to meet basic expenses for food, housing, healthcare, and household necessities. The census data also revealed the growing wealth gap within the older population itself. While the wealthiest 20% of older adults saw substantial asset gains between 2018 and 2022, driven largely by rising home values and investment account balances, most households experienced little to no improvement in financial security during the same period. Those in the bottom 20% saw no meaningful change in their wealth position at all. 11,000 Americans turn 65 every day. This demographic wave is arriving at retirement age in the context of a pension system that has largely collapsed, a Social Security system under fiscal pressure, and a healthcare cost environment where a 65-year-old retiring in 2025 can expect to spend an average of $172,500 on healthcare expenses over the course of retirement, a number that represents more than the total savings of the majority of Americans in that age group. 9 million older Americans cannot afford food and medicine. The choice between food and medicine is not a hypothetical scenario deployed by advocates to illustrate policy arguments. For millions of elderly Americans, it is the specific decision that arrives every month when Social Security deposits into a checking account that will not stretch far enough. In 2023, nearly 7.4 million seniors aged 60 and older faced food insecurity, meaning they lacked enough food to lead an active, healthy life, according to data from the National Council on Aging and the United States Department of Agriculture. Among minority seniors, that rate was higher. The food insecurity data coexists with a parallel crisis in prescription drug costs. About 1 in 4 adults aged 65 and older scrimp on food, utilities, clothing, or medication due to healthcare costs, according to the National Council on Aging. Among older adults with incomes below $25,000 per year, more than 1 in 5 of whom carry medical debt, the trade-offs are not marginal. They are structural. Every month, these Americans calculate which need they can afford to fully meet. The Federal Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, SNAP, commonly known as food stamps, was designed to address this gap, but the program is dramatically underutilized by the elderly population it is intended to serve. Only 38% of eligible adults aged 65 and older participated in SNAP in 2023. This means that roughly 62% of elderly Americans who qualify for food assistance are not receiving it. Among those who do receive SNAP, the average monthly benefit for a single elderly adult amounts to approximately $23 in some states. That is the equivalent of roughly 76 cents per day. $23 per month for an elderly person living alone, managing multiple chronic conditions on a fixed income. An amount that one advocate at a food bank in the Northeast described to NPR as barely enough for milk, eggs, and bread. 83% of baby boomers still carry credit card debt. There is a particular cruelty in the financial situation of America's baby boom generation, the 76 million Americans born between 1946 and 1964. They were the most educated generation in American history up to that point. They entered the workforce during decades of economic expansion. Many of them owned homes whose values multiplied. And yet, as they move through their 60s, 70s, and into their 80s, an overwhelming majority of them are carrying consumer debt. In 2025, 82.9% of baby boomers carried credit card debt, with an average balance of $6,795. According to data compiled by the National Council on Aging, this is not the debt of people who overspent on luxuries in their working years. This is the accumulated weight of decades of stagnant wages, unexpected medical expenses, economic downturns, and a healthcare system that can convert a single hospitalization into a 5-figure out-of-pocket bill. The research from Clever Real Estate's 2025 retirement survey found that almost 2/3 of American retirees, 64%, still carry some debt beyond a mortgage, including nearly 1 in 3 with more than $10,000 in non-mortgage debt. Among retirees who are supposed to be living on fixed incomes derived from Social Security, pensions, and savings, carrying $10,000 or more in high-interest consumer debt is not a minor burden. It is a structural tax on every monthly budget, consuming money that was meant to cover food, medication, and utilities. The psychological weight of this debt is also documented. 64% of American retirees, nearly two-thirds, report having regrets about their retirement, and 53% say they prioritize preserving their finances over enjoying retirement. A majority of the retirement years that Americans spent decades anticipating are being consumed by financial management, not by the comfort and security those years were supposed to represent. 146,000 seniors experienced homelessness in 2024. The image of homelessness in America is not typically elderly. It is not a 78-year-old woman who raised a family, worked for decades, and owned a home. It is not an 82-year-old widower who lost his apartment after a medical emergency consumed his savings, but that is exactly who is now appearing in growing numbers in shelter systems, on park benches, and in emergency rooms across the United States. According to the Department of Housing and Urban Development's 2024 point-in-time count, the federal government's annual one-night census of the homeless population, approximately 146,150 Americans aged 55 and older experienced homelessness on a given night in 2024. That represented approximately 20% of the entire homeless population in the country. People aged 50 and older are now the fastest-growing group experiencing homelessness in the United States, with most entering homelessness for the first time in their lives. The triggers are documented and consistent. The death of a spouse, a divorce, a sudden job loss, an eviction following a rent increase, the onset of a serious health condition that consumed savings and disrupted the ability to pay rent. Sandy Markwood, the Chief Executive Officer of U.S. Aging, the national association representing area agencies on aging, described the situation in interviews with national media. No one imagines anybody living on the street at 75 or 80, but they are. The financial arithmetic that produces elder homelessness is direct. Almost 1 in 3 older renter households pays more than half of its monthly income on rent. At that level of housing cost burden, a single surprise medical bill, a fall, a hospitalization, a new prescription, is enough to trigger the cascade. Among older adults who do fall into homelessness, nearly half, 46%, end up living unsheltered in places not meant for human habitation. Shelters are not designed for people who need help with daily activities, who cannot climb stairs, or who require medication management. 48% of retirees returned to work out of necessity. They had retired. They had made the calculations, decided the timing was right, and stepped away from the workforce. Then something changed. Rising grocery prices, a medical bill that insurance did not fully cover, a property tax increase, a year of inflation that made the budget numbers stop working, and they went back. In 2025, a survey by AARP found that 7% of retirees had returned to the labor force since September of that year alone. Among those who returned, nearly half, 48%, said they did so out of economic necessity. Only 14% said they returned because they wanted to stay active. The survey, conducted among more than 2,000 adults aged 50 and older, found that 41% of returning retirees were back at work specifically to pay for everyday living expenses. Not vacations, not discretionary spending, but groceries, utilities, and medications. This trend is reflected in federal labor data. The labor force participation rate for Americans aged 65 and older reached 21.4% in 2025, up from 19.3% in 2020. The number of employed Americans aged 65 and older ballooned more than 33% between 2015 and 2024, according to a CNBC analysis of Bureau of Labor Statistics data. By comparison, The labor force for all workers aged 16 and older increased less than 9% during the same period. More than 35% of respondents to the AARP survey said that age discrimination would prevent them from finding work, a barrier that compounds the financial pressure. Workers in their 70s seeking part-time employment in healthcare, retail, education, or service industries report consistent experiences of employers hesitant to hire them. The option to supplement a failing retirement income with part-time work exists in theory. In practice, it encounters systematic barriers that leave millions of elderly Americans without the income they need and without the jobs they have returned to seek. Poverty steals 9 years of life from low-income seniors. The final accounting of the American retirement crisis is not measured in dollars. It is measured in years. In 2025, researchers at the National Council on Aging published an analysis drawing on nationally representative data from the Health and Retirement Study, one of the longest-running and most comprehensive longitudinal studies of aging Americans in existence. The finding was stark. Low-income older adults die on average 9 years sooner than those with the greatest wealth. Those in the lowest wealth bracket, with annual incomes of $20,000 or less, died on average 9 years earlier than those earning $120,000 or more annually. The mortality rates among older adults in the bottom 60% of wealth were nearly double those of people in the top 20%. 9 years. That is the price of poverty in old age in the United States in 2025. The National Council on Aging's president and chief executive, Ramsey Alwyn, described these findings in a formal statement as shocking and unacceptable, saying that in the wealthiest country on earth, poverty is literally stealing almost a decade of life from elderly Americans who worked hard and played by the rules. The mechanisms are not mysterious. Poverty in old age means inadequate nutrition, delayed or foregone medical care, exposure to environmental conditions that accelerate physical decline, chronic stress that damages cardiovascular and immune systems, and social isolation, itself now documented as a mortality risk equivalent to smoking 15 cigarettes per day. These forces do not operate independently. They compound each other year by year, producing the 9-year gap that the data reveals. 11,000 Americans turn 65 every day. More than 17 million of the people over 65 already living in this country are economically insecure. 1 in 3 elderly Americans does not have enough money to cover their basic needs. And for those who fall into poverty, who run out of savings, lose their housing, cannot pay for medication, the consequence is not merely financial difficulty. It is a shorter life. And in America in 2026, that outcome is becoming more common, not less.